Good evening. Welcome back to St. Thomas for our final session of Dying Well. It's good to see all of you here. This evening, we have Lily Matson, who's a medical social worker with Grain Hospice, and Jay Sperling, funeral director and counselor over at Sperling Funeral Homes. And so we're excited to learn about what they do and just, be challenged and figure out a whole lot of things. So let us pray. Lord, we thank you that you have given us the opportunity to engage in these hard topics and the opportunity to speak and learn from experts throughout all different aspects of dying. Help us to learn well and listen well tonight and not be afraid to ask questions. In Jesus' name, amen. And if anybody is thirsty, we have coffee or water out in the parish hall. Feel free to get up and get it right now or just in the middle of a presentation. We will have refreshments at the end as always. And so you know, our schedule for tonight is Lily will give a presentation and then Jay, and then we'll do some combined question answer with both of them. So let's welcome Lily.
All right, let's see. Can you hear me? Is it on? Oh gosh. Can you hear me? Yeah? Oh, there I am. Okay, all right. Yes, I'm very soft-spoken, so if anyone's having trouble hearing me, just like give us a little thumbs up or something. Let me scoop this up. All right, it's good. All right. So my name is Lily Matson. I work for Grain Hospice. We're a local hospice agency. We cover this area, the Beaver area, Westmoreland, Allegheny. We're really all around the area over here. So I'm a social worker on the team. I know you've had several sessions before this that kind of went over a few of the other disciplines that we work with on the team. All hospices do work with an interdisciplinary team setup, which really helps us cover all the bases, the medical, spiritual, social, emotional, the whole thing. So I'm going to be going over, like I said, what I do as a social worker. There we go. All right, so social work for a lot of people is kind of it's a big umbrella. Social workers can work in so many different settings. You know, most people immediately think of like a children, youth, and family situation where a social worker comes in, and I get a lot of sort of stigma about the social work role. I have a lot of patients who are like, whoa, what did I do wrong? Why is the social worker here? But in the hospice realm, I'm not there because something's wrong. I'm really a part of the team. I usually like to sum it up in one little sentence of everything that's not directly medically or spiritually related, I'm your girl. So anything emotional, I'll show on the next slide a few of the things that I do. So social workers, especially in the hospice side of things, we really are focusing on any needs that are of the emotional kind of space. So I do a lot of work with advanced directives. I'll go over each of these, by the way, in my slides after this. So I do a lot of help and work with advanced directives, emotional support and end-of-life counseling, family mediation and support, vigil, so when someone is at the very last hours and days of their life, I do a lot of support at that time, resource brokering for anything that's needed along the way, team communication. The interdisciplinary team that we work in hospice is really helpful because our nurses can't always be there and always be on top of it. So we're all very informed on the end-of-life process and things to look for medically and spiritually. And so being able to all go in and see the patients, the families, we're really able to communicate and make everything a little bit more efficient and well-rounded and communicating with each other and making sure that all the bases are covered. I like to say that I'm kind of like a midwife, but for end of life rather than birth. I'll get into that in a little as I go on. So working with advanced directives, one of our main documents that we have everyone fill out is called a POLST. It stands for a Pennsylvania Order for Life-Sustaining Treatment. So this is whether you would want to be resuscitated or do not resuscitate, whether you would want to have a feeding tube or IV fluids, things like that. This can be a difficult thing for people to go over and kind of come to terms with when they first come on hospice. So, with the hospice philosophy of, we're not here to cure and we're really here to manage symptoms and kind of let everything take its natural course and manage symptoms along the way and keep people as comfortable and as high a quality of life as possible during that whole journey. So we, obviously usually recommend that people when you're at the point of hospice, are a do not resuscitate order. When you're at that point, the process of CPR and things like that can be more detrimental than helpful. Often, when people are frail or at the point that hospice is necessary, the CPR and the things like that, if it is able to revive someone, it's usually not in the best quality or the most comfortable way. So I have a lot of hard questions, or a lot of hard questions and conversations surrounding that document and what the different decisions will be on that. Another thing a lot of people ask is, one of the questions is asking about antibiotics. And with hospice, we're here for comfort, and a lot of times antibiotics mean comfort. We don't, for example, if someone were to have like a UTI, a pneumonia, we do often give antibiotics for that, and so that's another part of that conversation that I'm often having. I can help people with decisions about power of attorney. I know you had an actual attorney last week, I'm sure he touched on this, but the first person that comes to mind may not always be the most appropriate person to be power of attorney. It's a big role to hold, and it's important to make sure that the person that you're choosing is really able to fulfill your wishes rather than sometimes fulfilling their own. Grief is a hard thing, and some people, when it really does come to that point, may make decisions, that are sort of more for their grief rather than what your wishes are. So a lot of discussions about that as well. Living wills, estate planning, and just really the importance of being prepared. So I do provide a lot of resources too for different attorneys, things like that.
I think you may have just answered my question. So if you don't have those documents and you decide to work with an attorney to do so, you leave someone in your role able to help someone understand what those documents mean and what the various details are that you need to make decisions about.
Yes, yeah, so I usually have sort of the preliminary conversation, kind of give you a rundown on, what should be looked at for each of those decisions, and then I often provide the resources for attorneys and things like that in the area to then, get those papers legally and do all of the legal side of things. But I do have a lot of conversations. Some people aren't quite at the point where they're ready to talk to the attorney, and they just kind of want to talk it over first. So I do a lot of that, sort of counseling that way. Yeah. And not everyone does have a power of attorney, and that's fine. Not everyone has to have a power of attorney, but that's a choice I usually often discuss with people as well. As I mentioned, I do a lot of emotional support and end-of-life counseling. One of the main things that I do with people is called life review. So I make routine visits one time a month, if needed. Some people are, just need a little bit more than that, so I will make visits more frequently. At the very end of life, I try to make visits daily if it's possible. I am in a lot of different counties right now, so trying to figure that out. But I'm usually able to make visits daily at that point. But when I'm doing my monthly or bi-monthly visits, we do a lot of life review. So we're really going through our patients' lives from beginning to end, the happy, the sad, everything in between. And really just kind of making peace with that and processing. You know, we each have our own kind of individual, beautiful life. And so doing that life review is very helpful to kind of tie up loose ends and process different things that we may need to process before our life comes to an end. Sometimes with the life review, people will want that written or in some sort of video form. We'll sometimes do that for the family. But more often than not, it is a private thing that people will kind of do with just me and sometimes the chaplain when he goes through a spiritual approach to it all. Being able to be an objective support provider is very helpful in the hospice situation. Sometimes, you know, I mean, we have history with our families. We've been with them for a very long time. There's good blood, bad blood, you know, everything in between. And so having a social worker to not have that history with, someone that you can sit down with and just kind of bear it all, and there aren't going to be any consequences. You know, everything that we talk about in my visits is confidential. So that seems to be very helpful for people as in terms of processing things. And, you know, there may be some things that are on your mind that you definitely don't want your children to know. So we do a lot of that as well. So yeah, there's a lot to come to terms with at the end of life, and a lot to talk about and work through, and just kind of gain perspective about how the cookie has crumbled. I do a lot of, you know, helping to ensure a beautiful or good death. A lot of people are like, what? Death isn't that always, you know, a beautiful or great thing. But, you know, I do my best to try to make it a dignified, peaceful, meaningful experience. You know, death is a part of life, and so I have a lot of conversations about what you want that to look like. You know, in a perfect world, what would you want that room to be like when it is your time? Who would you want to be there? Who do you not want to be there? That's an important one too. You know, even so much as the lighting, the music, all the little details about in the perfect world, what would that look like? So that we can do our best to set that up. You know, everyone is different, and everyone comes with their own experiences, cultural beliefs, and things that are important to them. So we have a lot of discussions about that, just to try to make it as beautiful as it can be. You know, like I said, death is a part of life, and so that's kind of where I think of sort of like a midwife, but at the end of life. So I'm sure it's been talked about in the other sessions that hospice has changed so much in the past 10, 20 years. It's not just the last hours, the last days. I've had a lot of people that have been on my caseload for a year, 2 years, and honestly, the sooner that we're able to get involved, the better. You know, the longer that I have to develop that relationship with people and build rapport, and you know, that's not something that I can just come in and say, hi, I'm Lily, what would you like your death to look like? You know, that's not necessarily how it works. So it takes time, you know, to get to trust each other and understand each other a little bit. You know, my first visits are usually just kind of general conversation and figuring out what each other is like. You know, people need to know about me if I'm going to be. It's a very intimate and vulnerable situation. So yeah, and a lot of times, you know, I'm not even necessarily counseling, but more being a witness to people's grief and to people's stories. We all want to feel heard and cared for, and that's a big part of my job. I also help organize different trips and outings if possible. Some people are at the point physically that that's not feasible, but we've had patients that have you know, really wanted to go to one last baseball game. So I'll do whatever I can to organize that. People that have had big weddings or baby showers or really important family events, things like that. So lots of conversations about that, and we'll make it happen if it can happen. And usually that's something that if transportation is needed or things like that, hospice will usually cover if I can make a good enough case for it, which I've gotten pretty good at, so. A lot of my work is done with family members. In my experience, more often than not, the person that is dying is accepting of their situation, and it's the family that is definitely not. So I do a lot of work with educating and doing counseling, just trying, helping them get to the point where they're ready as well, and that they're ready to also to follow the wishes of the person that is dying. A lot of people don't want to let go, a lot of family members as well, and there can be some contention with that when the person that is dying is ready to and the family's not. That's a really, really, really tough thing. So I do a lot of mediation where I'll sit down with, again, being that objective person is very helpful. Because I can sit down with the family and the patient and have those hard conversations and kind of be a barrier almost, like someone they can bounce things off of, and I can help them navigate it, whereas the conversation might not go so smoothly with just the family and the patient. It's like I said, it's a very vulnerable, difficult time. So I do a lot of help with that. We do hospice at home, nursing homes, assisted living facilities, personal care homes. We can do it pretty much anywhere. So I'd say I do a lot more family work with the home situations. We're not there 24/7, and sometimes it can be very, very difficult for family members, daughters, sons. That role reversal is really difficult. Being the kid and then all sort of being the caregiver now, being almost the parent. And the parent doesn't want to give that up, even as they're declining, they're like, I'm still your mom, you're gonna listen to me. And so, especially with patients that are able to be at home, doing a lot of education. The families, we don't provide 24-hour care. We provide a 24-hour nurse on call, but it's the family members that are having to provide the care, change bedding, change diapers if needed, give medication. That's always a really difficult thing. So I try to make sure that the family members have a solid support system and people that they can call when those things get really tough, and someone that can come relieve them. Oh, one other thing I wanted to mention is bereavement counselor. So we also have a bereavement counselor on our team. They are mostly coming in after the person on hospice passes. They provide bereavement counseling to the families for an unlimited amount of time. That's covered through Medicare. Usually it's about a year. So they do follow up and sometimes get involved while the person is on hospice. But usually I do the majority of the counseling while they're a patient with us. Okay. So vigil is another big piece of what I do. So when people are nearing death and what we call actively dying, and that's the last hours, the last days, I often go and sit vigil. Sometimes the family is able to be there and sometimes they're not. I will, especially with patients that may not have family available, I'll go and spend half or sometimes my whole day just kind of sitting with them, making sure that the environment is comfortable, making sure they're comfortable. Like I said, we are kind of very trained on what pain looks like, what discomfort looks like, and so we're also assisting the family and the facility staff. If you're at a nursing home, assisted living, we're assisting them to make sure, if I'm right there and I see you're uncomfortable, I can go alert them and they can medicate you or do what needs to be done to get you back to that comfortable state that is really the goal. And a lot of times, family, again, it's nice to have an objective person there. I initiate a lot of reminiscence at the bedside and just talking about great times and singing songs and, me and the chaplain usually work together in that way. So, some people, in my experience, some people want to be alone when they pass, and some people don't. Some people will have their family come and sit for 3 days straight, and they'll never leave. And they'll go to the bathroom or go to take a shower for 10 minutes, and that's when that person chooses to pass. And I do a lot of sort of counseling on that, because a lot of people will say, oh my gosh, I left my mom alone. She died alone. But from what I've experienced, the person that's dying absolutely has a hand in the way that they die. And so, it's incredible how some people will wait, and some people will wait till everyone gets out of the room because they want to be alone. So a lot of different counseling things like that at the very end of life. Resource brokering, again, anything not medically or spiritually related, that's on me. So the need for caregivers, the need to transition facilities. So if someone's at home and the family really cannot handle it, I help with the transition of finding the right place, getting the transportation set up, making sure everyone at the facility is aware and comfortable with the situation. And I really oversee that whole process if it's necessary. It isn't always necessary, but when it is, I really assist with that. And again, need for additional caregivers. If this is a home situation, a lot of people need the extra support. So I help find private caregivers or agency caregivers, and I know lots and lots of resources in the different counties that we work in, so I help to navigate that. And he'll talk more about, of course, the funeral side of things, but I also have that preliminary conversation with people as well about what their wishes are, cremation, burial, body donation, which a lot of people have actually been doing lately. I've seen kind of an increase in that. So I have the preliminary conversation that then we hand over to the funeral director, which is next up. So that's about an overview of what I do as a social worker. It's a lot of things and also not a lot of things at the same time. They're all kind of, like I said, under the same umbrella. I really, my job can be really difficult, but I absolutely love it. Being able to help people make their death as personalized and beautiful as possible, even though it is a very heartbreaking thing. I put a little quote here at the end. Death is not the opposite of life, but a part of it. That's, very much kind of the motto that I think of and that helps me do this work, is that this is an inevitable piece of life, and if there's any way I can help make it a more beautiful one or an easier one for anyone, that's why I do what I do. So that's it.
Thank you.
Question here.
Yeah, and I'm going to work on getting Jay set up on the projector, and we'll take a couple questions now and then some more after Jay as well. So, yeah.
Am I still on? Okay.
I was just wondering about payment. It says Medicare, Medicaid.
Yeah.
In the facility that you have, where that is, but how about home and
It's at both home and facilities. Our hospice does not have its own hospice facility. Some of them do offer that, but we provide it in any nursing home, any personal care home, any assisted living, and at home. So all of those in any realm, it's fully 100% covered through Medicare. And if we have some folks that are too young for Medicare, so at that point, it will be covered by Medicaid. But there are no out-of-pocket costs for anything provided through hospice. All of it is 100% Medicare, which is one of the great things I get to talk about, because we never hear that. You never hear 100% covered. You never hear no out-of-pocket costs, but luckily, hospice is completely covered.
you have nurses or other staff besides yourself at hospice?
Yes, at Grain Hospice, again, we work in an interdisciplinary team. So we have registered nurses, the social work, myself, chaplain, bereavement counselor, and aides. So they all come a bit more often than I do. Myself and the chaplain come once a month. Aides for a home patient situation can actually come up to 5 times a week. And the nurse usually comes once or twice a week, even in the facility. So if someone is in a nursing home, we provide the aides on top of what they're getting at the nursing home. We're essentially driving the bus. So you're at the facility, but we're kind of the ones doing the comfort care. We're writing orders. Our aides are coming in to shower and do things like that. So yeah, yep, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I was under the impression that Medicare would only cover for a certain amount of time. You said get involved as soon as you can. And I don't know why 6 months sticks in my mind. Maybe we all covered for 6 months.
Yeah, so one of the qualifications or, the bits that need to be in place for you to be able to get on hospice care is that a doctor needs to write an order that you essentially have 6 months or less to live if the terminal illness were to completely take its course, Some people, when they get on hospice, the doctor does make that determination, but a lot of times when people get on hospice and they come off of all of those medications, there's a period of time where people kind of have a bounce back and are having a better quality of life because your body's just not, it's a little too much, So we get everything reorganized, and a lot of times people can stay on hospice. So when you get on hospice, there's a 90-day benefit period. After that first 90 days, we reevaluate you medically. And as long as we can document some sort of decline, as long as you're not getting markedly better, you're then approved for another 90 days. After that 90 days, we reassess. If there's decline, then after that, it's every 60 days that we reassess you. But that benefit is unlimited. So as long as if we can document some sort of decline, you stay on hospice for as long as necessary. You can also come off hospice and come back on. So some people get a little bit better for a while and they plateau, they come off, and then 2 months later, they really start declining again, so they come right back on service. There isn't necessarily like a big waiting period if you were just on or anything like that. Yeah. Yep, yeah, to get off hospice, it's really just the signing of a paper, and then you're off hospice. And then if you need to come back on, we get those orders, we get everything in place, and you're back. Yeah.
Thank you. Let me go back to the sound.
We good? Can everyone hear me? Perfect. First off, I know what pastor feels like. Everyone's sitting towards the back. We have our good churchgoers in the front. No, seriously, that's okay. That's one of my. I look at death probably a little bit differently. Sometimes I think when people hear funeral director, they think someone's going to walk in like in the dark suit. And like obviously and be like, well, thank you very much for coming this evening. We enjoy that you're here today. No, that's not me. I believe that in this industry and what I do, I need to be who I am. So a lot of the times, things like you guys sitting in the back, I'll say that at the funeral home too. If we're having a service in our chapel and everyone's walking into the chapel, I'll tell them, guys, this isn't church. We can sit up front and fill from the front back. So that is part of it. But again, thanks to Pastor for being here. Lily, you did a great job. Thank you. We often pick up, like she said, where hospice leaves off. And we get those phone calls from them 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, asking us to come out and serve a family and get that person into our care from there. So a little bit about me real quick. You'll see my name's Jarrett Sperling. I go by Jay, so that is what most people call me. Hold on, I'm going to figure this out. I emailed my presentation to Chris, so instead of using my computer, I'll be a little not figuring it out. So who am I real quick? So I'm a funeral director. I'm licensed in Pennsylvania. I own Sperling Funeral Home in McCandless. Our family started in the funeral business in 1921. My grandfather opened a funeral home on the north side, then my father opened one in Millville, and then I moved us out to McCandless. So those areas were changing demographically, and we felt that that was our best move for the future. I do not aspire to be a big funeral home. I serve about 60 to 70 families a year. I am pretty much a one-man show. I do everything. I meet with the families, I do the embalming, I run the funerals, I do viewings, I do everything. It's my choice to be smaller because I can be more intimately involved with the people that we serve. And then I don't have to worry about a lot of different things. I pretty much control the way everything goes on. I find that families are very happy with that too. If they're talking to someone, they're talking to me, and I'm the one that's putting most of this stuff together for them, so it works out. Along with being a funeral director, I am also a licensed professional counselor in Pennsylvania. Bereavement work is a big part of what I do. I work for Anchor Point Counseling Ministry. I am their bereavement director. And through there, what we do is we offer multiple spousal loss grief groups in the North Hills of Pittsburgh. Passive and Hospital Foundation helps fund us with those groups, which is great. And when I'm not doing that, I'm a dad and a husband, and I coach kids, and all those different kinds of things come into play. Okay, I'm gonna skip that one. So here's the deal. Usually I do these talks, and a lot of times it's like a 2-hour block that I get. So I have a whole presentation that's like 2 hours and then questions and answers. I've cut most of it out so that we can get to the nitty-gritty today and stay within what we're doing. I look at funerals more as a goodbye. And it's a softer approach to it, right? Because a lot of times we think of death, we think of funerals. People tend to have negative connotation to that. Just like I talked about people feeling that the funeral director is kind of the Grim Reaper. I think that being able to say we're having a goodbye or planning a goodbye is a better way to do that, because that's really what we're doing in essence. Changing the wording just makes it a little bit easier sometimes for people to talk about it and discuss it. Like Lily said, it's very hard. A lot of times the person that is dying, like if they're in hospice care or something, will want to talk to us, but it's their family who doesn't want to talk to us. I don't want to deal with that right now. Now, interestingly enough, in a perspective, my job, I look at myself not just as a funeral director, but a crisis intervention counselor. And I really pull that off from my degree, because what I'm doing is I'm helping people in crisis. I'm not helping people who are grieving at the funeral home. Grief only begins about 20 to 30 days after someone dies. So in actually, mourning is technically the period in between grief and death. So most people who come to me are actually mourning, they are not grieving yet. So that's a very important distinction to make. And at that, I always look at it this way: mourning is considered the acute part of stuff, if you want to take a medical perspective to it. Mourning is your acute phase. Grief is your long-term, almost chronic phase that occurs with people. So I'm dealing with people at that time who are mourning. And our crisis intervention work is really, we see all different kinds of things with people when they come in. Some people are panicked. They don't know what to do. They can't believe this person's gone. Other people have had a beautiful death, and they consider it a blessing that the person passed, and they are ready to take the next step in helping say goodbye to them and fulfill their wishes. So it's very interesting. So how do people want to say goodbye? Most of them are up here, and this is the stuff that we focus on. People can choose to have burials. They can choose, well, in Pennsylvania, so that you know, there are multiple ways of disposition. And technically, the state looks at funeral directors as the people that are in charge of a person's disposition. Disposition can include burial. It can include cremation. It can include anatomical gifts. It can include removal from state. So there are some of the things that, you know, we basically say these are the ends of what Pennsylvania allows a person to do. You can have a memorial service. You can have different remembrances. It can be, you know, a person can be cremated, and then you can have a picnic in the park afterwards. And we'll help you put all of that together. Typically, traditionally, In Western Pennsylvania, you will see a lot of families that will choose to do viewings. And then after the viewing, there'll be some type of service, be it a church-based service or more of a humanitarian service where it's more of a celebration of life. A lot of times I lead those for families if they choose that. And it can be as meaningful as people want, and sometimes people don't want meaningful. They just want, like, let's do it and get it done. And that happens a lot. One of the interesting trends we're seeing is more simple funerals. I used to do lots of elaborate funerals. Who remembers the 2 and 3 day viewing times, right? My dad and my grandfather would have told you, oh, viewing was till 11 o'clock at night, and then we opened doors at 7 in the morning so the people working shifts could come in all the time. And that's why funeral directors a lot of times lived above the funeral homes, was because viewings were basically nonstop. Especially when you got into the city where the mills and everything were at. You could accommodate the people who were working shifts. So that was interesting. And then almost everybody would go to church for a service, or you'd have a minister come in. Those days are certainly changing. We are finding that more and more people are choosing, well, and I'm sure this is a hard subject to say in a church, but I know Chris will probably, pastor will tell you this is something that's happening. Less and less people are churched, right? So now they're walking into a funeral home and they're not churched. So what do we do when I ask someone that simple question? Well, what type of service would you like? Do you have a church home? And more than not, I'm getting the answer, oh no, we don't have a church home. No, they really didn't do that. So the question then becomes, how do we help you say goodbye? Because saying goodbye is important. It's important emotionally too. And it doesn't have to be the traditional way. It can be like this. It can be different. It can be having disposition first and then having some type of service later. And that's what we're finding a lot of. We're also finding a lot of people that are choosing to do like a 2-hour viewing and then in a service immediately following. Our society is extremely mobile, and even though COVID has slowed us down, people still want to be like in and out, without a doubt. All those things are the stuff that we can help you with. So in Pennsylvania, I always like to kind of make these distinctions with people because there's a lot of misnomers. And part of it is in Pennsylvania, only a licensed funeral director can help you plan a funeral and can conduct a funeral. That's very important for people to know. Anyone, including Costco or a cemetery or any other place, can sell you funeral merchandise. So you can buy caskets, vaults, memorials, urns, jewelry, or anything you want for a funeral from an outside vendor. But in Pennsylvania, only a funeral director can actually sit down, meet with you, and do the disposition of the deceased. So there's a good distinction there for people to know and understand that. What we usually do, what I do, the steps with people are pretty simple. We sit down, and basically I go into counselor mode, like I said, when I meet with people. The first thing I do is just let them tell their story. Like, that's what most people need to do. They've been through something that is life-changing. And a lot of times the best thing to do, and I want to hear, what's their story? What just happened? Was there a prolonged illness? Was this very sudden? Was it unexpected? Was it tragic? What happened? And that's twofold. One, it's to help me figure out what kind of services and who the person was if I didn't know them and all that stuff. But part of our grief process in what we do when we grieve, we need to tell the story. We need to tell our story of what happened. And in the beginning, we need to tell it over and over and over and over again. And by telling it over and over again, what we're doing is our brains are now making the death real. because a lot of times it doesn't feel like it's real. But by telling our story, we can begin to realize that the death has actually occurred. And that's what I want to do. That's what I want to do, is be able to sit down and just hear what people have to say. What happened? Sometimes they haven't told anybody. They haven't had a chance to tell anybody. It's just been very quick. And all of a sudden you're sitting down in front of me. So we like to let them process. I like to let them process what's going on. We gather information, stuff that we use to fill out death certificates, obituaries, all the kind of things you would typically expect. I am a proponent of pre-planning a funeral, not because it's future business for me, but because when you pre-plan a funeral, you are giving a funeral director information that maybe sometimes your family doesn't know. More than not too many families know your mother's maiden name. And that is something I need, because that's on a death certificate. Who your father was and who your mother was and what her maiden name was. And let me tell you, in Pittsburgh, we have some maiden names that are pretty good. And in the last month, I've heard some that I've never heard before. So that's, it's stuff like that pre-planning is good for, because you're giving information to the funeral director that they don't have to worry about. So after I gather that information, we'll talk about, what type of goodbye you want. I went over that a little bit. Burial, cremation, visitation, no visitation, all that good stuff. And then obviously, you got to talk about how you're going to pay for a service. Simple as that. Funerals aren't free. We are not nonprofits, but some people think we're nonprofits. We will always work to make sure that a family can get a service that is affordable to them if they need that, without a doubt. But I think that is very important. And a lot of times when people prepay or they come in and pre-plan, they can come into us and say, oh, I have this Prudential life insurance policy I plan on using, or, we want to pay it now, or multiple different methods that they can go through. So. Okay, quick. I just want to go over rules to prepaying too, so that you guys understand this. If you choose to pre-plan your funeral, you'll see a lot of stuff about funeral pre-planning. It is the things that I talked about. It's actually, I also like pre-planning because every family has a decision maker, okay? They have that one person. And Lily touched on this a little bit, and I got where she was going with this, right? Like sometimes who you think you want to be your POA really shouldn't be your POA, right? Okay, she touched on that. So sometimes that person, when I'm meeting with family members, they're the person that's saying how they want your funeral to be. If you didn't pre-plan, it's not your funeral, it's what they want your funeral to be. Right? And most of you can probably imagine who that person is in your family sometimes. And you might not always agree with the way that they do Sunday dinner. So will you agree with the way that they want your funeral to be? Typically, no. So that's why I encourage people to pre-plan, because you can get what you want, not what they want you to have. Does that make sense? A lot of people don't look at it that way. They kind of look at it as this, I'm afraid of death, I don't want to talk to the funeral director, Grim Reaper kind of thing. But take a look at it the other way. Who do you want planning your service? That's a big thing to me. Remember that in Pennsylvania, whenever someone pre-plans their funeral through a funeral home, we have to put 100% of the dollars into a third-party account. We are not allowed to touch it. When I pre-plan a funeral with someone, I am doing my services for free at that moment. Because guess what? I'm not going to get paid until that person has passed away. That is a consumer protection that Pennsylvania has put into place, and it is very good. I also look at it as a personal protection for funeral directors. Because what if I pull out onto Route 8 and some crazy truck comes out of nowhere? Thankfully, I'm going to go Dickey Road home, so we're going to avoid Route 8 today. But what if that happens and something bad happens to me, and then all of a sudden you're like, oh, that Sperling guy died. Man, we gave him $9,000. We better see what happened to that. And you go to my wife, and my wife's like, man, didn't we go to Florida that month on that really nice vacation? So I'm also protecting them by knowing that the money that you give for pre-planning a funeral is put away and saved in the future. So basically, if you pass away at some point in time and a funeral home is not in operation, you can take that policy to any other funeral home and say, hey, listen, this is what we put away and this is the services we want. Will you handle it for what we have? And I would say that 95% of the funeral homes in Pennsylvania or in Pittsburgh area would do that. Some would be like, no, we'll be more. But most will say, yeah. Most of the family runs would definitely do it for you. So that's a very important thing to know. 100% of your dollars gets put into either an insurance policy or a trust, and they're made irrevocable. So that goes back to Lily. If you're on a spend down to get onto Medicaid so that they'll cover your nursing home care or whatever, in Pennsylvania, well, every county has a different limit, but you are allowed to, in Allegheny County, I think the number is like around $15,000. You're allowed to shelter that into an irrevocable burial trust. And it doesn't just have to be the funeral home. Like, we can put the money away for you, but you can include in that like everything that surrounds a funeral. Like, you can put money away for a wake, you can put money away for flowers, you can put money away for the funeral home, you can put money away for a cemetery, you can put a nice donation to pastor in there. You can put all that stuff in there. So it works out pretty good, and that money magically disappears. Okay, cool. And this is really the last thing I want to go over, and then we'll open it up to questions for everybody. There is a difference in Pennsylvania between what cemeteries can do for you and what funeral directors can do, funeral homes can do for you. And I think that is a very important distinction to make. Funeral homes are licensed by the state. There is a state board of funeral directors. The state board of funeral directors regulates us. If I do something unethical, immoral, someone files a complaint against me, or anything on those lines, a state investigator will knock on my door and have the complaint in his hand and say, okay, what do you think about this? And occasionally, every once in a while, great once in a while, you'll hear a news story about a funeral director that did something bad. Maybe they did steal pre-need money, or maybe they didn't fulfill services, or maybe there was, a bunch of urns in a safe that were supposed to be buried and they never buried them, right? Like, that happens. Every industry has bad things happen occasionally. We are held accountable for that. I have seen a few funeral directors go to jail for a very long time and lose their license and their ability to provide a living and have to pay restitution after they got out of jail to families. So we are regulated, and Pennsylvania takes that very seriously. Cemeteries are not regulated on what they can do. They fall under the real estate board in Pennsylvania, and they have a broker, and their brokerage is really about selling property more than anything. So whenever it comes to selling merchandise or anything like that, they really have no rules. Also in funeral service, the Federal Trade Commission regulates funeral homes. We have to provide every consumer that we meet with and talk about prices to, we have to provide them a general price list. We can dictate what our prices are, but the form of the general price list has to have mandatory disclosures in it that are common across funeral service with funeral homes across the country. So basically, you can compare apples to apples, right? So if you come to my funeral home and get a price for this type of service, you can call Matt Schellhaus, you can call Devlin's, you can call any of them and get the same price for the same type of service. Cemeteries don't necessarily have to do that. When they provide merchandise and so forth, they can often change the prices. They also do not have the same requirements for putting money away. So when if you buy a casket, a vault, or anything like that from a cemetery, they only have to put 70% of the money into trust, and they can use 30% immediately to pay for administrative costs. There is also something called constructive delivery in Pennsylvania, so that if you buy, an example, a monument from a cemetery or a burial vault from a cemetery, and they place that monument in the ground but without their end dates on it, they are now allowed to use up to 90% of the money you gave them because it was delivered. If you buy a burial vault off a cemetery, some cemeteries will call you and say, hey, listen, we have this great thing. We're going to put your burial vault in the ground so that it's there and you don't have to worry about it. We know it's good to go. Well, the key of why they're doing that is it's constructive delivery. That means they have delivered your product even though you're not using it, and they are now allowed to take more of the money and only hold a small bit off to the side. I always tell people this. If I went down to the car dealership and said, hey, guess what, I'd like to buy a car from you. But here's the deal. I want you to take all the oil, all the radiators, I want you to take all the fluids and everything out of that car, and I want you to wrap it in plastic and just put it back in your lot. And in about 15 to 20 years, I'm going to come out and pick that car up and just have you put everything back in it. Am I going to expect that car to work the same way as the day I bought it? So it's the analogy and how that pans out. I always like to just tell people, hey, talk to your funeral director first. There's no commitment. You don't have to pay anything. You don't have to do anything, but get a good idea of what they offer before you do the other part. Goes back to the Grim Reaper thing, though. Sometimes people feel more comfortable at cemeteries because it's not the immediate death that we remind them of at the funeral home. So, cool. My abbreviated talk because we wanted to leave time for questions. Hey, I will say this to you too. You stand up. My stuff at Anchor Point, and most of you know of Anchor Point Counseling Ministry. I saw when I said that, a lot of heads were shaking around here. We're a full-service counseling center down on McKnight Road. We work with tons of churches in the North Hills, and we provide counseling to anyone. We started out with youth as the North Hills Youth Ministry Counseling Center, and we have changed into Anchor Point. We are a Christian-based organization, so we are not afraid to do Christian counseling. We have pastors on staff that are also licensed counselors or master social workers, licensed social workers. And so we do the full range of services for families and individuals. Our bereavement support groups, we have 2 of them that we're running currently. One meets the first and third Tuesday of every month. We meet at St. John and Paul's over in Franklin Park from 7 to 8:30. I get about 13 to 14 people a week that come to that. They're actually becoming a pretty tight group. That's been going on for about a year now, that one. And then the other one actually is meeting at Anchor Point, the second and fourth Wednesday of every month from 1 to 2:30. I started that group 23 years ago. So it is still running 23 years later as an ongoing support group. I focus on spousal loss. That is what we focus on. There are other support groups around for general bereavement in our area. There's also a lot of churches that will run the brain fart. The one grief program, it's like a 13-week grief program. You'll see it around a lot of the different churches. I'll think of it before you leave, I promise. Like Passive and Hospital runs a bereavement support group. There's also a lot of addiction support groups. And if you have a child that is grieving, I volunteered for 15 years at the Caring Place, which is a center for grieving children and their families in Pittsburgh. Actually helped open up the original one in downtown Pittsburgh with Fred Rogers, which was a really cool experience. And was with them for years and then helped them open up the one in Warrendale. So if you have family that has a child that is grieving, that is the place to go. And thankfully this week, I think, they are starting in-person counseling again. So I just got that email the other day, which is awesome. So, okay, cool.
And before we open up to questions, I might get in trouble if I forget to mention your church would really appreciate it if you pre-plan your funeral service. And so your church probably has a planning guide already made up. If you're a member of St. Thomas, talk to Carol. We'll also put it up on the website. It's really simple. It goes right through our whole liturgy, and there's places, oh, you have a choice right here. Here's some recommended hymns if you want some recommended hymns, or here are the recommended readings. This is another spot that a music could go, etc. We have a more general one as well, I think, with a list of just like appropriate readings and appropriate songs. But it's really helpful. Go talk to your church administrator, plan out your own funeral, because like Jay said, if you don't do it, then it's not what you want, but what whoever's in charge wants, and it won't be you.
You either like On Eagle's Wings or you hate On Eagle's Wings. Okay? Like Chris and I can tell you, it's Amazing Grace, On Eagle's Wings, the Old Rugged Cross. I can give you the 5 funeral tunes, and most of us just use initials for them. We don't even have to write them out. So I will tell you a funny story though. There was a priest at one of the churches that the church will remain nameless. The priest will remain nameless. But he was very, 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 very liberal in what went on. And he would always, run to the funeral home when I was meeting with the family and would call him, say, hey, we got a funeral. I'll be right over. Now, at first, that scares me a little bit, right? But I got used to him, and he'd come in and he'd sit down. He'd go, okay, let's go over the whole mass now, and then start picking songs and stuff. And he'd go, what did they like? What did they like? What kind of music did they like? Oh, well, Grandma really liked the Bear Barrel polka. She loved the polka. Okay, we'll take care of that. We'll play that in church. Now, for those of you that are understand Catholicism, and really a lot of times I always say, if you put an Episcopal, Lutheran, and a Catholic in a brown bag and shake it up, you'll pretty much pull the same thing out each time, right? Okay. Communion meditation comes, the organist starts playing the Beer Barrel polka. And that priest allowed anything to go. We did Stairway to Heaven, from Led Zeppelin, Stairway to Heaven once, and I'm almost my mind is exploding. The organist is I can't believe I'm doing this. But it worked, and that priest allowed it, right? Which was cool. So to Chris's point, you could get the Bear Barrel polka if you don't like it, and someone else does. So, exactly. Okay, what questions do you have for us?
For both Jay and Lily.
Yeah. I did want to mention real quick too, a lot of people don't realize that when someone passes away, their body is released to the funeral home. So a lot of my patients are like, this social worker is heckling us to talk about this funeral home thing. And I try to explain, when someone passes away, they don't go to some sort of middle ground where you then have several days to figure out which funeral home you want, or, it's, when someone passes away, you have about 2 hours to figure that out, which is why I try to do my best to do that ahead of time and to make sure people understand just the, some people aren't necessarily ready to pre-plan it, but even just looking over finances and choosing a funeral home is so important.
It makes it so much easier for me if someone calls me and says, hey, I wanted to let you know our dad is in hospice care. They're saying it could be a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, we're not sure. And I can say, oh, okay, do you want to come in? Sometimes they say yeah, sometimes they say no. But if they say no, I can at least say, okay, what's Dad's name? And is he going to, the plan for them to pass it home? Oh, okay, yeah. And when he passes, does he want to be cremated right away? Or do you want to be buried? Do you want a viewing? No viewing. Well, we know that he wants cremated. We're trying to figure that, okay, cool. I can write that down. Usually I write it down on my phone, right? Because when do most of these deaths occur, Lily?
Yeah, middle of the night.
Middle of the night.
1:30 in the morning, 3 o'clock in the morning, yeah.
So we function at 1, 2, 3, 4 in the morning without, we go. It's time to go. And it's better for me to go, oh yeah, I talked to that family member and I know what's going on. And it makes it so much easier. And time frame wise, what's your, I'm going to ask you a question to help them, right? So family calls you and says, hey, we think they passed away, so your nurse has to go out. Is your nurse going to be there right away?
No. It can sometimes take an hour, maybe hour and a half, 2 hours, it depends.
Because a lot of times the deaths happen like conveniently, nicely spaced apart, or do they happen like bam, bam, bam?
Yeah, everything, sometimes things all happen at once. And when someone's already passed away and there's someone passing away but they're uncomfortable, that sort of becomes the priority.
So the procedure of how that works a lot of times is the hospice nurse has to show up at the house, and then the hospice nurse will pronounce the person. They'll call the medical examiner or coroner to say, hey, we have a patient that died. This is their diagnosis. We have Dr. So-and-so who is going to sign the death certificate. May we release the body to the funeral home? And the medical examiner or coroner at 2 a.m. is going to be like, yeah, we don't want to come out. We'll be glad to release the body to the funeral home. And then they call me, and then our target is 60 to 90 minutes to be at your house. And I think that's a really good target time. But a lot of times people don't know that. When they call me and they're like, well, the hospice nurse is here, everything's good, you can come over now. Okay, we'll be 60 to 90 minutes. Well, the funeral home's only a mile away. Why is it going to take you that long? Well, it's 2 a.m. We're not a fire department.
Yeah.
Like, we're not an ambulance. People aren't just sleeping in the on-call room ready to jump out. Like, 2 people have to get together in one vehicle and then get that vehicle to where you're at. And most funeral homes in Western Pennsylvania, there is probably about 5 or 6 removal services that funeral homes employ. And these people will go to people's houses and nursing homes and so forth and take the person into their care for us and bring them to our funeral home. So, like I said, I do a lot of stuff myself, but at 3 a.m, I'll handle the phone call, I'll dispatch the team, but I'm no good for you at 10 a.m. if I've been out since 3 a.m. So, and they all have good backs, I don't, right? So, okay, sorry, go ahead, questions.
Yeah.
My parents got a prepaid plan from grants in the 80s because they had a motorhome and they were afraid if they had a crash in Texas, the grants would come and clean the bodies and bring them back and take care of all that. All I had to do was go pick up the funds. Fortunately, none of that happened. My dad died 15 years ago. My mom called him the other day and said, you still have that plan, don't you? Do we expect that whatever increase in price has happened will be covered by the interest this third-party account has earned?
Mostly yes, is the question. Each funeral home decides what their policy will be towards prepaid funerals and how they if they choose to guarantee them, what parts they choose to guarantee, or if they don't choose to guarantee them. So how it works is on those third-party accounts, and I use 2 different ones, and I make the determination as to which account we choose to use. If someone is in a nursing home infirmed, or a family's coming to me saying, hey, it's not going to be long, but we got to put this money away right now, I am going to use a burial trust through the Pennsylvania Funeral Directors Association. It's kind of a short-term thing. I think our current interest rate is like 2% compounded, so that's not bad, not simple interest, compounded. And we'll just put the money in there, and then it'll accrue interest. The nice part is when you take the money out of that trust, the trust pays the taxes, because the state always has to get their taxes, right? The state, they'll pay their taxes on the income from the original principal amount. So people don't see any bills, they don't see any 1099s or anything like that. So that works good. If someone is younger and healthy, and younger is a different kind of determination, I consider now, really, you're only starting to get old like if you're hitting 90, right? Like people are extremely active, and what we considered old 20 years ago, even 10 years ago, is not the case anymore, right? So I'm a life insurance agent in Pennsylvania, and a lot of times I use a company called Great Western. and they write specialty insurance for funeral homes. Basically, it works this way. If you plan a funeral and your funeral is, $5,000, that's what your insurance policy costs, $5,000. We don't oversell you, we don't undersell you, and it gets that interest. Personally, at our funeral home, I guarantee that my services and merchandise will be covered when you prepay. I do not guarantee cash advance items. Cash advance items are monies that go outside of the funeral home that we pay on your behalf. Death certificates, church, sometimes cemetery, those kind of items that I don't have control over what they're going to cost in the future. I have a little bit of control over my services. I have a lot of control over my services and merchandise. Last year, I did a funeral for a lady whose family, she was intellectually disabled, and her family started a savings account for her in the 1960s with my dad. And when prepaid law came into effect, they rolled it into a burial trust. And they had put away $500 in the savings account in the 1960s, and there was $9,700 in it when she died last year, which was enough to cover her funeral. So we personally will guarantee that we do that part of it. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, that's good.
Okay, cool.
If you prepay a funeral and have that all set up and then you die out of state, do you work with the out of state?
Absolutely.
Cremated, it's like you cremated.
Yes.
But a lot of people want to have their body actually flown back.
Yes, so all the time. And I will make one recommendation because we are a very mobile society. We go to Florida for the winter. We do all kinds of things like that. My recommendation is if you or someone you love passes away in another state and you want to bring them back home, call me or call the funeral home in where you want them to be to get them here. Because how this works is funeral homes have trade rates with each other. So if you call me, I'll call a funeral home where that person's at, and I'll say, hey, it's Jay Sperling in Pittsburgh. I'll look up to see if they're a family-owned funeral home. Typically, they're a little bit easier to deal with than corporates. I will call them, and I will say, hey, listen, I have this death. Can you pick this person up, embalm them, and get them on a plane for me here? And basically, I'll say, what's your ship-out charge? And they'll tell me what their ship-out charge is, and that'll be a discounted rate. If you call that funeral home directly, as the consumer, the FTC regulation kicks in, and on our general price lists, we have a specific line item that says forwarding remains to another funeral home. That is a retail price. So you'll get charged the retail price, then plus my retail price. So if you call me directly, then I'll get a wholesale price from them and handle everything, and you'll save money. So.
Being really, especially if you have a friend who died and they didn't know anybody there, and so the hospital just picked somebody that ended up phenomenally expensive to get.
Yes, I can tell you this. I'll give you a good example of that. In Western Pennsylvania, direct cremations, there are providers that'll do a direct cremation for around $7.95. Now, they'll tend to nickel and dime you for other things, and there's other funeral homes that will do direct cremations for $4,500. So there is a wide disparity between them. I'm $2,200. I'm in the middle. I feel I'm fair.
Yeah.
And that includes your medical examiner fee and crematory fee.
Yeah.
So.
And with that preliminary conversation that I often have, I'm usually discussing things like that. I know generally the prices of different places, what different places can offer. So I usually do a little bit of that. You know, if you only have this amount of money, you're going to want to look at this place or this place, and so yeah, that's one of the things I usually help with too. Because yeah, the
It is wide.
Yeah,
I don't
range is very
understand
wide.
why. In California, all funeral homes are required to put their prices on their website now. Pennsylvania, we do not have that. I don't know when that'll happen, but my prices are on my website. Like, if you want to see what my prices are, go to my website. You can see them. I have nothing to hide. I do things a little bit different. Funeral homes used to live and die off the profit of a casket or their merchandise, right? So you'd go into a casket showroom and like the first casket you would see would be the least expensive one. And then you'd go like around the room and you'd get to the first one you saw was the most expensive one. Okay. Then you'd go around the room and you'd get to the end, and the last one you saw was like the cheapest tin can you could see, and you're like, I don't want my whoever in that. And you didn't want to walk around the room again, right? Because like the caskets were going to eat you. So you'd go, I'll take that one, which is the expensive one, so that you can walk out the room. I do not do that. That is not how I operate. I believe that there isn't a piece of funeral merchandise that will get you into heaven, and there isn't one that'll keep you out. So I base my fees off my service charge. So that's where I make money, is my service charge, because I'm a licensed funeral director, and my license, just like a doctor or a lawyer or anybody else, my service is what's valuable. The merchandise, like I said, you can get it at Costco, you can get it anywhere else. I charge $200 over the wholesale cost of a casket. So I buy my caskets from Matthews Aurora. They send me a new price list October 1st every year. If you want to pre-plan, make sure you pre-plan before October 1st, because that's when all the prices go up for everybody. When they send me my price list, the caskets that I sell, if it says that it's $1,000 on my price list, I sell it for $1,200. So I really could, and so I make the same amount of money if you buy the tin can or pine box, or if you buy the mahogany or bronze. Same amount of money. So I really, doesn't make a difference to me. Pick what you're comfortable with.
If someone has an unplanned death, I mean, they just, you're going to turn over their death.
Happens.
Do you call 911?
Yes.
And then what happens?
So this is not an uncommon thing. I feel like I'm taking all the questions.
Oh, no,
here.
no, no,
Okay,
no,
good.
go ahead.
I inject humor into what I say a lot of times. So I am a repository of stories. I've been doing this for 25 years licensed. I started in the family business with my dad when I was 15, probably younger than that, but like I started to remember things after then. You don't know the amount of times, especially when we had the funeral home on the north side, that people would walk up to the front door, knock on the door. You'd come downstairs. Hi, how can I help you? Yeah, I just went over to my pap's house and he's on the floor dead there. Can you just come over and get him? No. What do we got to do? Well, we need to call 911. Well, he's dead. Why do we got to call them? They're not going to save him. He's dead. That's the procedure we have to do. Now I typically get that phone call instead of someone knocking at the door, except in McCandless, probably about 5 or 6 times. Someone has come up to the door and they'll be like, we know we wanted to use you, but we didn't remember what your name was. So we just came to the door. Now the internet's helped out a lot, right? But yes, so what is going to happen is you call 911 and then you say, I found so-and-so, my loved one. I believe they are passed away. They're cold to the touch. We need someone to come out to the house. Could you please don't come lights and sirens? And you can tell them that. Tell them not to come lights and sirens. Because like every ambulance and police officer loves to turn all their lights and sirens on to get places quick, which is, hey, that's a perk of the job, right? Ambulance will come. They'll put a defibrillator on them, make sure there's no heartbeat. When there's no heartbeat, then the police then consider it a death investigation. So then the police will, at that point in time, start to ask you questions like you sometimes feel you're guilty, but that's their job. Well, what happened? When did you find him? When was the last time anyone saw him? And most of the times they can tell, like you said, if it's in bed or something like that. Then they'll collect who the person's PCP was, primary care physician. They will call the medical examiner's office or the coroner, depending on what county you're in. They will give them the information. The coroner or medical examiner will then call that PCP. They'll ask them if they are under their direct care and they're willing to sign a death certificate. If the PCP or doctor is willing to do that, then they'll call the cops back and they'll tell the cops to release the body to me. And then they'll call me, and then 60 to 90 minutes will show up. In cases where they can't determine it, or maybe there's no doctor that'll sign it, then the medical examiner or coroner will come and take the person. Or if they feel there's a suspicious death, accidental death, suicide, anything like that, your coroners or medical examiners are pretty much going to take them. So it's only when it's deemed to be natural. And if a medical examiner takes, at least in Allegheny County, if a medical examiner takes a person, that does not guarantee that there will be an autopsy, or at least an internal autopsy. They'll do an external examination a lot of times, and then make a determination of what the cause of death could have been from that. The medical examiner's office is extremely busy with overdoses and so forth. So if they can make that determination without that internal, they'll do that.
So if someone dies in a nursing home, they already have
Nursing home deaths have to be reported to the coroner or coroner or medical examiner, but they will be released to us. Unless they say there's a fall involved.
Yep.
So a fall. So like if I get a death, like let's say we get a nursing home death and person comes to the funeral home, 2 days later I get the death certificate signed by the doctor and it says like cardiac arrest, and then the secondary cause says fractured hip. I have to call that doctor and we need to have a discussion about that. Because if that is remained on that death certificate, now that doctor's in trouble because that wasn't reported to the medical examiner or coroner's office. Now, sometimes that fractured hip was a year ago, right? And it's all healed, but the person declined in that year. So, was it really a cause of the death? No. But you just have to be careful. Yes, ma'am?
You both mentioned anatomical gifts. Are you referring to the Humanity Gift Registry?
Yes.
Okay.
Mhm.
Is that the only place where you can donate a body?
They are, go ahead.
I was going to say, I know there's two that are the ones I usually work with, Science Care and MedCure. You heard of these? Mm-hmm. Those are the two main ones that I'm usually, families are working with. And when you donate your body to science, to one of these two places, it is completely free. And they will conduct their research, and then they will send back whatever cremated remains of what they haven't used for their research, and usually give you a little kind of information about what it was used for. So I have actually seen a pretty good increase of people doing that, especially if people don't necessarily have the funds. It's a way to donate your body to, any sort of research, and then also get those cremated remains back, and then maybe later have a celebration of life or something like that. There are a few things, communicable diseases and like Hep C and things like that, where you cannot donate your body. And the COVID thing is also, I think it's within like the last 6 months, if you've had COVID, they cannot take the body either. But yeah, I've seen a lot of people doing that more recently.
So that with that, most bodies in Pittsburgh, Western Pennsylvania, that are anatomically donated, Human Gifts Registry, they will end up at University of Pittsburgh Medical Center or somewhere in this area where doctors and surgeons and so forth can practice and students can learn and all that. The procedure for that, so that is if they are eligible. So right, there's a phone call. So like it's not like you just get to pick anatomical gifts. So like she calls me, okay, or the nurse calls me. Oh, this is an anatomical, because you have to use a funeral director in there. because the funeral director still has to file the death certificate. So, and the person still needs picked up, right? So there are certain guidelines that we have to follow in making sure that the person's refrigerated and within a certain amount of time. And the human gifts registry people in Pennsylvania are in their offices like daylight hours. So sometimes you pick a person up and then you find out later they weren't eligible because of some other issue that was going on. But then we transport them to, no, we don't transport them. It depends. Sometimes we transport them. Most anatomical gifts end up at the Pittsburgh Institute of Mortuary Sciences, where depending on what your use is, they will do different embalming methods to preserve the body. And then from there, the gifts registry will send them to wherever they're to go. And that is different than core organ donation.
I was wondering about that too. So if somebody donates their organs, do you get the body first? And then, like, because I want to be an organ donor. So where would I go?
So depending on where and when you pass away, so in Pennsylvania, like, hospices aren't required to report deaths to core. Core basically runs this half of Pennsylvania, right? You're not required to do that.
I don't believe
No, you're not.
so.
But all hospital deaths have to be reported to core. And core will then determine if the person's eligible for donation or not. And if they are, then they'll talk to the family and the family can turn it down or accept it. If the family accepts it, then core will either book the next available operating room at the facility the person is at to harvest whatever organs they want. It can be skin, eyes, bones, internal organs, whatever. And then that person will be released to the funeral home from there. Or core built a facility out at RIDC Park. So they will harvest organs there at their own facility also. Yeah, and that's...
That could be 2 or 3 hours after death.
Yes, but you have to remember that not many, it is a smaller percentage of people are able to donate their heart, liver, lungs, the sustainable organs. Most organ donation is retinas, corneas, skin, is what most donations are. So, and then occasionally you'll get people that will say, take whatever you want. And, they come to us and they've got like no leg bones and it's like interesting. So, but that's okay because that's what they wanted to do. And, we work from there. And do not ever let you think that organ donation will disclude you from having a viewing. It should not if you want one. It'll make our job a little harder, but yeah, okay, so you got to save a couple lives. I'll be okay with making my job a little bit harder for that.
I have to give one quick comment. I like antiques, and I've heard a lot of stories. And I heard stories in Johnstown about this. They used to do wakes all hours of the night. The family would be there. And this one time, the body had rigor mortis, so they wired the body down. And of course, in the middle of the night, the person sitting there in the coffin is sitting there praying. Wire snap and the body snapped.
So I'm gonna that. So right, like here's people ask me that question. I'll tell you two things. First off, one, if a body ever sits up on me, I'm out. I'm done. It doesn't happen. I'll just let you know that right now. That is like wives' tale. Bodies don't sit up on people. Okay, again, I'm out. Like seriously, out. Good story for you, right? It's Halloween. I'm in mortuary school. We get a funeral, and it's me and another student. And the person was at the old St. John's Hospital on the north side. Who remembers that, right? And at that point in time, it had turned into a hospital for mental health. Okay, so, if you want to use the old vernacular, right? The crazy people were there. Okay, so now it's Halloween, It's like, midnight, and here we are going to the crazy hospital to pick up someone who passed away, right? We get the person, they're on the cot. We start pulling them out. Security is usually the one that's with the funeral home. And Carl's at the one end of the cot, I'm at the other end of the cot. And Carl's like, did you hear that? I'm like, hear what? He's like, I heard something. And I'm like, stop. And he's like, so we keep going, and he's like, no, honestly, I hear something. And I'm like, what are you talking about? There's a noise coming out of that bag. And I'm like, are you kidding me? And he's like, no. And at this point, I turn and look at the security guard. I thought he'd be the next, like, he's white, right? Like, white as a ghost at that point in time. And Carl's like, we got to figure this out. And I'm like, okay, open the bag, right? So we unzip our bag, and the person's in a body bag. And, like, now you can hear, like, this muffled noise. So, like, oh, my God, this person's still alive. So we zip open the bag, head first, right? Person's obviously dead. Open the bag more. Their personal effects were at their feet, and they had a transistor radio, and their foot hit the on button on the transistor radio, and it was like KDKA or something that was muffled in and out with the person. Never so happy in my life that was a situation. But that's the kind of things that happen to us, and you don't get to tell those stories often, but there is a repository of stories that I could write a book about sometime on those kind of things. So, good leadway, thanks.
Yeah.
To transport remains from one state to another, do you have to do anything in particular?
It depends.
Okay.
So, I have to have, it depends on the state, and it depends on what reciprocity Pennsylvania has with that state. Okay? Some states in Pennsylvania do not agree on things. And the license from one state does not allow that funeral home to come into Pennsylvania and take that person out. Nor do we have permission to go into their state and take the person out without another funeral home. Other states we get along with, which means if someone dies in that state, I can cross state lines, pick the person up and bring them back, and then have a funeral director from that state file the death certificate for me. So it depends on where you're at.
Well, I expect when mom's time comes, you'll be grant that takes care of her. She'll be cremated, but she'll be buried in Wisconsin.
Oh, if she's cremated wherever she's from, wherever she dies at, then once you're cremated, disposition's complete, and you can be sent, someone can drive you wherever you want. You can go carry on a plane with the proper documentation and make sure you're in an urn that can go through TSA. You can ship the person to another funeral home or directly to the cemetery. The United States Postal Service is the only organization that will send cremains in the United States. UPS and FedEx will not. So, or you can fly them cargo on a plane and have someone pick them up someone drop them off at the airport and then someone pick them up at cargo wherever they're going.
So the purpose of that certification, when we get to Wisconsin, is to let that funeral director know that all the paperwork is done.
You don't even need a funeral, half the time you don't even need a funeral director there. Like if you're gonna be buried at the cemetery, disposition's already happened. All you gotta do is call the cemetery and you can take the body there or you can take the urn there and you'll have a permit already with the urn and you can just take the urn yourself. I mean, that funeral director's probably mad at me now, but, and I get people who call me and they'll say that all the time, like, hey, we want to use a local cemetery, person was cremated somewhere else. Can you help us coordinate all this? And I'll tell people, I'm like, listen, I'll do that for you without a problem. Give me $200 and I'll do all the coordinating, take the liability, make sure that it's to me and then over there. That's like an easy thing. So it's not like, I feel that that's fair for my time, but, doesn't necessarily have to happen.
I have a question for Lily. I have a mother who's 97 in a nursing home.
Yeah, so it depends on really what her diagnoses are and kind of what sort of condition, medical condition, physical condition that she's in. Oftentimes the facilities will reach out to family and be, kind of introduce that conversation. I think it's time for hospice, et cetera. But at the end of the day, it's the doctor that needs to write the order for hospice. So if you, again, it's that doctor that's making that determination of 6 months or less with the terminal illness. So if she is declining in any way, if someone's walking, talking, going to bingo, doing all sorts of, if there's no real no decline that way, it might not necessarily be time for hospice, but it is a good conversation to have with her doctor.
Should the decline be physical as opposed to mental?
So it can depend. So a lot of our patients, Alzheimer's is considered a terminal illness. So you can come on to hospice with Alzheimer's being your primary terminal diagnosis, because the stages of Alzheimer's, it's a terminal condition. So it depends. It depends on, again, if the doctor's willing to make that 6 month or less determination. And like I said before, just because a doctor gives you 6 months or less doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be. Sometimes, absolutely, it could be 2 weeks. But again, I've had people on my caseload that have been there for a year or 2 years. You're welcome.
I had one person in my career that actually got kicked out of hospice. And she came in, made funeral arrangements with me. She got everything exactly the way she wanted. I knew her. I was the best man in her son's wedding. We knew each other, and she had scleroderma, and this was it. She had another attack. This was it. It wasn't going to be long, feeding tube, the whole 9 yards. And then 3 months later, I saw her and her husband at the Cheesecake Factory having dinner. And I'm like, you look great. And she's like, yeah, the doctors don't get it.
Yeah.
And I'm a walking miracle. She died 2 years ago in January, which was 20 years from that day.
Yeah.
From that time. So, I mean, hospice did a great job. They cured her.
Yeah.
Right?
We call it graduating.
Yeah,
You are graduating from hospice.
From hospice. That is awesome.
Yeah.
And I did want to say one last thing too, because it just kind of popped into my head when you were there. If you have, you do have people, I have people who have pre-planned funerals with other funeral providers, right? They're transferable in Pennsylvania. It's your money. You can transfer it somewhere else. So let's say you lived in the South Hills, right? And you pre-planned your funeral down there years ago, and you moved 15 years ago or 10 years ago up to the North Hills, and you're like, I don't want to go back down there. My circle's here. My people were here now. You can transfer without a doubt in Pennsylvania. So just so that people know and understand that. You're not always locked in to what was picked before if it's not logical for you to do that. So.
Well, let's give Jay and Lily a big thank you. And I want to say one more time, as you know, this was a free workshop we've been putting on, but we are collecting donations for the UPMC Benevolent Care Fund. It's a fund for UPMC, kind of their elderly communities and those people who are in the most need, who've run out of their own funds and rely on the generosity of others to get the care that they need. And so there's an offering plate kind of right in the middle of the aisle. Please consider supporting their cause. And I hope you will also all join us for some brief refreshments, coffee, tea, water, and some cookies in the parish hall. And perhaps Jay and Lily will stick around and answer a few more questions if you want as well. So thank you for coming. It's good to see you all. Hope to see you another time at St. Thomas.
Thanks.
response letter.